dedicate tonight's shiur because it's 30 days since Jenny Bard passed away, Stephen Bard's wife, and we wish Stephen long life, and may this shiur be an aliyah for her neshama. Kevin, if you start with the halacha, then I'll carry on and teach the Gemara.
Okay. It's continuing with the theme of acquiring a friend. It says here, according to Rambam, the word acquire indicates that one should do whatever it takes, even if this demands a financial or mental effort, and even if it necessitates undertaking actions to please the other person and to draw him near to you. Hence, to acquire a good friend, one must always be a good friend. In the second Mishnah in Avos, chapter 2, verse 13, cited earlier, Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai gathered his students and asked them to look for the most important attribute which encompasses the most other positive character traits. Rav Yeshua's response was a good friend, one, the praise of his teacher, for it encompasses all of the other fine attributes that are hallmarks of good character. However, this response begs further explanation, since choosing a good friend is not an inherent personality trait like the other cited in the Mishnah, such as a good heart or a good eye, and it is dependent on others. Several commentators resolve this difficulty by explaining that the intent of the Mishnah is to teach a person to be a good friend rather than to seek a good friend. Such is the position of the Sfas Emes and also the Merkeves HaMishneh, who explains that acquiring a friend is actually a directive that he himself should be a friend to others and guide them on the straight path. And this is the meaning of you shall love your fellow as yourself. And last point, the best part that the person should be a good friend to all, for one who has a good temperament and disposition with which he can obtain virtuous good characteristics, will be a good friend to all people. Therefore, it says that a good friend to indicate that the best path in life that a person should cling to is to be a good friend to one another. According to Rav Yeshua, chose good friend as the penultimate virtuous path in life, for it entails the manifestation of many other attributes such as a good eye and a good heart.
Okay. Good. Kevin, well read. All right, guys, let me just tell you where we are at the Gemara at the moment. We basically at 78b4. So we nearly finished the 78th daf. The progress is good. So basically, the Gemara actually cites a series of inquiries regarding the stipulation that a thief must sell the entirety of the animal. And this is what Kevin was getting to a few days ago, because he did do learning in advance. And this is exactly, Kevin, the point at which we're answering your questions. You have Yirmiyah inquired, if the thief sold the stolen animal for all time with the exception of 30 days, what do we mean with the exception of 30 days? We basically say that as far as that's concerned, he sold the entire animal from basically the date forward at which he put in the contract, but he retained the right to work with it for the first 30 days. Okay, so in other words, there's something being held back here. Or if he sold the animal for the purposes of slaughter, but with the exception of work. So what do we mean? Is that he granted the buyer the right to slaughter it immediately, but retains the right to the animal's labor in the event that the buyer would postpone its slaughter. Okay. The other example used in the Gemara was the cow was pregnant and he sold its entire body with the exception of its fetus. What is the law? Does a seller withholding any of these rights render the sale incomplete or not? So what we want to determine is, the previous cases we learned is that if you sell an animal, if the thief sells part of the animal and even leaves out 1/100th of it, there's no liability for the 4 or 5-fold payment. So in all these 3 cases, he didn't exclude any part of the animal's body, at which we've learned so far in the 78th daf, from the sale. But since he excluded a certain right inherent in it, it can be argued that he didn't sell the animal that he stole in its whole entirety with full rights. So what we want to know is, does this make the thief liable to the 4 or 5-fold payment? So basically, the other issues are pretty clear. The major inquiry of the Gemara is, well, how do you see the fetus of a cow? According to the one who says that a fetus is like its mother's thigh, which basically means that an unborn fetus is considered part of its mother's body, and that's a dispute in Tractate Tamura in the 30th and 31st daf. That's the one opinion. And then you don't have to inquire, because if you held back the fetus and it's considered part of the mother's body, then believe me, you haven't sold the animal in its entirety. For according to that view, the thief is deemed to have excluded a part of the animal itself from the sale. So when do you have reason to inquire, guys? According to the one who says that a fetus is not like its mother's thigh, meaning it's a separate entity. So what's the law? Do we say that although the fetus is not legally viewed as part of the mother herself, since it's physically attached to her, excluding it from the sale constitutes a meaningful exclusion, meaning even though it's attached by an umbilical cord, the fetus is still retaining its life from the mother, and it could actually damage the mother if the fetus pulled out prematurely, apart from killing the fetus. And therefore, excluding the fetus would constitute a meaningful exclusion. Or perhaps, guys, we say that since it stands to be separated from its mother at a certain point, excluding it from the sale doesn't constitute a meaningful exclusion to the cow that you're selling. It's 2 separate entities. So there's another way, there's an alternative explanation of the inquiry. There are those who say that the explanation is as follows. Do we say that since a fetus is not like its mother's thigh, excluding it from the sale does not constitute a meaningful exclusion? Or perhaps we say that since the fetus needs to become permitted together with the mother's through shchita, by excluding the fetus, it's as though the thief excluded part of the mother's body from the sale. So in the second explanation of the Gemara, it's bringing a slightly separate case. Because if a pregnant animal is slaughtered and the fetus is found in a womb, the fetus is automatically permitted for consumption on the basis of the mother's shchita, even if it is alive. So if the fetus is viable, you could just as easily shecht it itself, but the slaughter is unnecessary. In other words, you can rely on the mother's shchita to make that fetus eligible. Which, the only thing I'm not sure is if you killed that fetus in a non-kosher manner, would it be an avela, or would it still allow the mother's proper shchita to allow you to partake in it? So as far as I know, it would. But certainly, guys, if the fetus isn't viable, in other words, when we say a fetus is not viable, we mean it's premature and it died in the womb, it will die in the womb. So therefore, you don't have to shecht it. So the only way for it to become permitted is through the mother's shchita, because if it dies naturally, it can't be slaughtered. That's in the 74th and 75th daf of Bulin. That's exactly in the Vela. So our Gemara refers to a case where the fetus was not viable at the time of the mother's sale. So in other words, it was too young to survive outside the womb, or had already died, so that it actually needed the mother's shchita in order to become permitted. So we say that then constitutes a part of the mother's body, because the child needs the mother's body to exist? Or do we say it's still a separate entity? So according to this explanation of the inquiry, Yav Yirmiyah follows the opinion of Rav, that excluding a part of the animal that becomes permitted through shchita constitutes a valid exclusion. So Rav Yirmiyah inquires whether the exclusion of a fetus that is not viable qualifies under that category, even though it's legally not considered part of its mother, since it doesn't need to become permitted through her shchita, especially if it does according to Rashba. Okay, so the Gemara is saying, well, what is the conclusion? Is there any resolution? So the Gemara offers no resolution and concludes, let this matter stand unresolved. So now the Gemara is going to go into another inquiry. So the Gemara presents another inquiry regarding the definition of a complete sale. So Rav Papa inquired, and by the way, when the Gemara says let the issue remain unresolved, we're saying not just about the fetus, but about if you withhold some right from the animal where the new owner doesn't acquire it in its entirety, either it's work permissible for work, or the fact that there's a 30-day exclusionary term, there's a time limitation in which you could get benefit from the animal. Any of these sort of things, we don't know if that makes the thief ineligible to pay the full, liable to pay the full or fivefold payment. So it's going to remain unresolved. So the Gemara now presents another inquiry regarding the definition of a complete sale. So Rav Papa inquired, if one stole an animal, amputated it, and then sold it, what is the law? So what we're saying is, if you do, even though this is a shinoi, a physical change of the stolen object, through which the thief could acquire it and be exempt from the fine for a subsequent sale, because it actually doesn't change the animal's identity. Is just a physical change enough, or does it not really change the animal's identity in any way? So therefore, does this make the thief ineligible for liability? Okay, so do we say that he did not sell in its entirety, and is therefore exempt from the fourfold or fivefold payment? Or perhaps we say, with respect to what he sold, he didn't exclude anything. What do we mean? Is that he sold the entirety of the animal in its current state, and therefore he's liable to the penalty. So the Gemara offers no resolution on this point either and concludes, let it stand unresolved. Now, guys, obviously it's unresolved. I don't know if they resolved it later, but I can tell you something. There would be a problem with this because you're breaking two Noahide laws here. Even for a non-Jew, what two Noahide laws are you breaking, guys?
Tearing a limb of a live animal. And
Exactly.
what's the other one? Sorry.
Where you stole the animal.
Oh, theft. Okay.
Theft. So therefore, I would think if you had exemption for the 4 or 5-fold liability, then that would encourage people to break a second Noahide law, I would think. And it would be very cruel to the animal. So it's unresolved, but I wonder if there was a later resolution on the issue. So the Gemara cites a brisa which discusses various means of incurring liability for the 4 or 5-fold payment. The rabbis taught in a brisa, if one stole an animal and gave it to another person to slaughter for him, and that other person slaughtered it, or he stole an animal and gave it to another person to sell for him, and he sold it, we basically want to know also a case of if the thief stole an animal and consecrated it to the temple treasury, or he stole an animal and sold it on credit, or he stole an animal and bartered it for another object, or he stole an animal and gave it away as a gift, or he stole an animal and paid his debt with it, or he stole an animal and paid it with things that he had bought on credit, or stole an animal and sent it as a bridal gift to his father-in-law's house, great first impression, he pays a 4-fold or 5-fold payment. So, why, guys, do you think he's paying the 4 or 5-fold payment?
Because these are not sales. These are like what's it called? It's like bartering. It's like it's switching one thing for another.
And therefore,
So therefore, okay, so now I've got to think that all the way through. I'm in the right direction. So therefore, if he's not selling it, so normally the 4-5 payment applies when he does sell it. Yeah, he's not selling it, he's bartering it. So I'm not sure.
Okay, but why would it says, the Gemara says clearly, he pays the 4 or 5-fold payment. So
I'm trying to work it out.
What do you think? Okay, could I push you in terms of some reasoning? Yeah.
Yeah. Just help us, give us some tips. I've got I just can't think. I've got an idea, but I can't think now. Just give us some tips and let's see if we can get it.
If a thief stole an animal and sold it on credit, okay. In other words, I sell it to you, but you can't pay me for the animal immediately. But you make monthly payments. As a thief, do I gain, yes or no?
Yes, you do.
So why shouldn't I pay the 4 or 5-fold payment? Exactly. I'm gaining. All these.
So you're gaining on all of them.
Yes.
You're gaining on all of them. You're either relinquishing your debt, or not they relinquishing your debt. Either way, it's substituting for something else. So absolutely.
Correct. Exactly as Gavin said. So if he stole an animal and paid his debt with it, he'd have to pay his money anyway. Otherwise, they'll break his legs or take him to court. So he gains as a result of his debt being paid. And if he sold it on credit and the guy pays him monthly for this animal, he's gained money every month. If he sold and bartered it for another object, it doesn't mean that money has to exchange hands. It's known as chalifin, which means there's still, even though there's no monetary exchange, his transfer of its ownership is still tantamount to a sale. Because even, guys, if he received nothing in return, his transferring to a recipient's possession is the equivalent of selling it, insofar as making him liable to the penalty, because the Torah considers one who sells it as somebody that gained from it. Okay? And since he's lowering his debt, he gained from it. Or he also, so you'd say, well, what about a gift? Well, he's gaining favor from that person. So when you buy a birthday present for somebody and you give it to them, it's in order to gain their affection. So that again is a gain. It might not be a financial gain. But the fact of it is, the reason for the penalty is that the thief became rooted in sin. Because the minute he steals something and sells it, the original owner is very unlikely to get it back. So there's a twofold punishment. There's for theft, and there's a 4 or 5-fold penalty for selling a stolen object, because you've now committed 2 sins. Not only the theft, but you've robbed the original owner of ever getting it back. And you don't have any right to benefit from it directly. So as far as that's concerned, we want to know, what is the story about he sent an animal as a bridal gift to his father-in-law's house. Now, as I said, it's not a great way to make a first impression, because if it goes pear-shaped, that's your missus gone out the door. So in Talmudic times, guys, it was customary for a wife to remain in his father's house for as long as maybe a year following Kedushin. So that was the first stage of marriage, before completing a marriage through Nisuin and entering your husband's home. Today, guys, they join those two, because otherwise it's equivalent of having an affair. In those days, they had more self-discipline. So now they do a Kedushin and they do the Nisuin process under the chuppah. And then through beer, through sexual intercourse, and through the exchange of a gift, and through a ketubah contract, they do everything in one shebang, or at least the bang part happens on the night of the show. So during that year, basically the husband has to send bridal gifts to his wife at the father's house. So although already she's legally his wife, those gifts constitute a transfer of possession, right? Why? Because that's something she keeps on her own. It doesn't ever belong to her husband. As after that year, when she moves into her husband's house, anything that the wife acquires, the husband shares. So if he was to give the stolen animals a gift after the suing, if he was to give it after the suing, in that particular case, there is no full fivefold payment. And you might say, well, he gave his wife a gift. He got something in return. Well, the reality is he had it anyway in his possession. So therefore, he doesn't incur a penalty that he still possesses. That's the issue. If you give a gift to somebody and you relinquish possession, that's seen as a transfer of ownership. Gavin, your screen has gone unfocused again for some reason.
No, I've got it on blurred, and it's just it's fine now.
Okay, so if we look at
kind of deliberate
this case of stealing an animal and consecrating it to the temple treasury, why would they be eligible for a 4 or 5-fold payment? Because if you have a look in that case, the reason why the thief is liable to the 4 or 5-fold payment is because he transfers ownership to the temple treasury, and that's tantamount to sell it. So whether you give it to heaven or Shemaim, or whether you sell it to Shemaim, it's still known as a gift to another party. But if you consecrate it in holiness as an altar offering, you're not liable to pay the penalty, providing it transfers ownership also, in some opinions, through a domain, and the original owner having given up hope of finding it. In other words, Yush, despair, if you remember. So, in other words, if it's consecrated, the thief isn't deemed to have transferred it completely out of his possession, because in that particular case, it's still under his name. So it's as if he hasn't really transferred ownership with it if he consecrated it to temple treasury. But it depends. It depends on the circumstances. Generally, once it goes on the altar, there's no 4 or 5-fold payment. But consecrating it alone is not enough. Okay, because that's just giving it to Hekdesh as opposed to selling it. Whether you give it to a person or sell it, it's out of your domain. But if you put it on the altar, you're off the penalty hook. Okay, so what's the novelty here? Because it all seems pretty logical. If you're getting a benefit, why wouldn't you pay the 4 or 5-fold? So the novelty of the Bryce's teaching is that the first segment states, if he stole an animal and gave it to another person to slaughter it for him, and he slaughtered it, he's liable to the 4-fold or 5-fold payment. So guys, that's a novelty because it informs us in this matter there's an agent for an act of transgression. Because what we usually learn is as follows, is that generally if a hitman is hired by a mafia boss, the hitman gets the death penalty in the court because he's the direct reason the person left the world. The mafia boss will turn around and say, we never had such a conversation. And if he said, well, even if we had such a conversation, the guy had his choice. He could have decided to adhere to the law. He broke the law. I never broke the law. I told him to take care of the problem. He could have scared the guy. I didn't tell him to kill him. So it always comes down to there can be no agency through transgression in general, because a person is responsible for their own actions, and they mustn't listen to a person. They must rather listen to Hashem, and they know the law. Therefore, that person makes themselves culpable. But we said in this case, as far as theft is concerned, why is there agency through transgression? Well, there are two reasons for it. Okay. Well, the first one is in regard to the laws of the entire Torah. There's a general rule, there's no agent for an act of transgression. But here, with regards to the 4-fold payment, the reason there's an agent is responsible for the act of transgression is because, do you remember it used the word, he pays 4 or 5-fold, he pays 5-fold, he pays 5 cattle instead of an ox. Do you remember that statement? Guys, we learned it yesterday. So the word instead is coming to teach you that it's an exceptional case, because the Torah also states if a man steals an ox or sheep and slaughters or sells it, there's liability. Because, guys, whenever we juxtapose the word selling, we compare the two acts. So if you look at a thief that is about to sell the animal, and then he incurs the 4 or 5-fold payment, he cannot sell the animal unless there is unless there's what? Somebody to buy the animal. Yes. So therefore, he's got almost somebody else that got involved, and that was the only way he could do the activity. So by juxtaposing the pasuk, if a man steals an ox or sheep and slaughters or sells it, it means just like there's another party with regards to the sale and the thief is still liable, if there's another party regarding the slaughter, the thief is still liable for the 4 or 5-fold payment. And it also uses that word instead, which is a superfluous term. Okay, so that's teaching us this unique law, that if there's another person besides himself through his agent, the thief himself in this case is liable. Okay, it's not just the agent. So the latter segment of the brisa, which states if he sold an animal and consecrated it to temple treasury, he's liable to the 4 or 5-fold payment, because the Gemara also informs us what difference does it make whether he sells it to an ordinary person or gives it to an ordinary person? What difference does it make if he sells it to Hekdesh or he gives it to Hekdesh? Either way, whether you're giving it to a person or you're giving it to heaven, or you sell it or you give it, there's a problem. In other words, just as you give the animal as a gift to another individual, you deem to have made a sale because you get the emotional benefit and therefore it incurs the liability. So too, if you donate it to the temple treasury, you deem to have made a sale or some sort of gain, because everybody says to you, Shekayach. They don't know you stole it. So the basic point is that the penalty is incurred for giving the animal as a gift. That's the bottom line. All right. So we're going to tackle a new Mishnah, and I'm going to just share the screen. I'm not quite sure how long we've got, guys, but we can start it now. Okay, just hang on. Okay, well, that's clear as day. Now, hang on a second. Apologies, guys. Okie dokie. So, Gavin, would you like to read?
If he sold the animal in the owner's domain and slaughtered or sold it outside the owner's domain, or if he stole the animal outside the owner's domain and slaughtered or sold it in the owner's domain, or if he stole and slaughtered or sold the animal outside the owner's domain, he pays a 4-fold or 5-fold payment. But if he stole and slaughtered or sold the animal in the owner's domain, he is exempt. The Mishnah continues. If the thief found the animal in the owner's domain and was in the process of pulling it out when it died, while still in the owner's domain, he is exempt. If, however, he left it while it was still in the owner's domain, or he took it out of the owner's domain and then it died after he had performed the kinyan upon it, he is liable. The Mishnah continues. If he gave it to a Kohen for the redemption of his firstborn son, or to a creditor, or to an unpaid shomer, to a borrower, to a paid shomer, or to a renter, and he was in the process of putting the animal out of the owner's domain, and he died while still in the owner's domain, he is exempt. If, however, he left it while it was still in the owner's domain, or he took it out of the owner's domain, and then he died after he had performed the kinyan upon it, he is liable.
Excellently read, Gavin. Excellently read. So let's just study the first part, is that basically, if he stole the animal in the owner's domain and slaughtered or sold it outside the owner's domain. Well, let's just deal with what issue we're talking about. is that basically he found the animal on the owner's premises and he pulled it out of his premises and then sold or slaughtered it. If the thief pulls the animal out of the owner's property, it constitutes an act of theft. And that obviously then renders the slaughter or sale subject to the 4 or 5-fold payment. So what you've got to understand is the criteria for establishing an act of theft is no different for establishing any type of acquisition. So in other words, whenever, Kevin, you've got an act constituting a kinyan, an act of acquisition for a particular item, that's the same sort of physical act needed for theft with the intent to steal. Because in other words, if I'm stealing an item, what's the first thing I have to do?
Take ownership.
Well,
and the only way then you've got to leave the prop. You've got to get out of that domain.
Yeah, I mean, in order to, as Gavin quite simply said, if I wanted to go from the original owner's domain to my domain, I've got to lift the object up and put it in my car and drive away, or take it out of the owner's domain and put it in a new domain. That's exactly the act of a kinyan. And the act of mashicha is an act of pulling. That's one of the ways you require. Okay? So, or if you stole the animal outside the owner's domain and slaughtered or sold it inside the owner's domain. Now, I'm not quite sure practically how that would work. It basically means the animal was outside grazing and he pulled it in the owner's premises or slaughtered or sold it there. I think that's the surest way to get caught. But maybe if there are a lot of witnesses in the street and that guy was a casual worker, he could have known that there was a shed where you could slaughter the animal without anybody witnessing it. So it would make sense in that case, if he knows the lay of the owner's property, to pull it in and be out of sight when the animal disappeared, inverted commas. So in the previous case, he didn't become a thief with the initial pulling, but only after he pulled it out of the owner's premises. Because guys, think about how you break Shabbos. You take it from the private domain to the public, or the public to the private. That's also in a way sort of kinyan, okay? So the logic behind the kinyan of Mashiach is that it pantomimes, so to speak, the transfer of items out of the owner's possession into one's own, or in a public domain into a private domain. So that's what you need to, in order to effect a kinyan, okay? So basically that Mashiach, that pulling, is only one of the ways to acquire the animal. And what's another one of the ways? Well, we're going to get to there now. So if he slaughtered and sold, or well, basically if he stole, slaughtered, or sold the animal outside the owner's domain, he pays the 4-fold or 5-fold payment. Well, that's obvious because, again, that act of pulling seems a bit repetitive. But in all those cases, the thief performed an act of theft prior to slaughter or sale. So the subsequent slaughter or sale constitutes the slaughter or sale of a stolen animal. So before you can be liable for that, you have to make a kinyan. Otherwise, there's no 4 or 5-fold payment. But if he stole or slaughtered the animal, or sold the animal in the owner's own domain, he is exempt. Why? Why, guys, do you think he is exempt?
Well, it hasn't changed domain.
Correct. So there was no actual act of acquisition.
Yeah, there's no kinyan.
Yeah. But if he physically lifted the animal up and he never transferred domain, that is a kinyan on it as far as an animal is concerned. There are more than one ways to do it, but it doesn't make sense that he lift up a cow. He might lift up a sheep, but why just lift it up? It doesn't really make sense. But there are other ways to do it, okay? So the Mishnah continues as Gavin read. If the thief found the animal in the owner's domain and was in the process of pulling it out when it died, while it was still in the owner's domain, he is exempt. Why, Gavin?
Because it's still inside the owner's domain. It hasn't. It still belongs to the owner. It's not. He hasn't acquired it yet.
Exactly. So if the animal died naturally, not as a result of the attempted theft, a thief is liable for any unavoidable mishap, like a natural death, okay? Only after he stole it. But if it died before he pulled it out of the owner's domain, it wasn't considered stolen yet, exactly. So the thief didn't even accept liability, and he doesn't even have to pay back the principal, obviously, because there was no sort of acquisition. Exactly, Gavin. Now, if, however, he lifted it while still in the owner's domain, as you know, lifting is also a form of a kinyan. We took it out of the owner's domain and it died after he performed the kinyan above it or upon it, depending if he lifted it on top of him or just pulled it, he is liable. That's self-explanatory. So the Gemara says if he gave it to a Kohen for the redemption of his firstborn son, or to the creditor, or to an unpaid shomer, or to a borrower, or to a paid shomer, or to a renter, and he was in the process of pulling the animal out of the owner's domain and it died while still in the owner's domain, he is exempt for exactly the same reason as above. There's no kinyan. But if he lifted it while it was still in the owner's domain, which was an acquisition of sorts, we took it out of the owner's domain and then it died after he performed the kinyan, he's liable. So we're gonna obviously go through those various aspects tomorrow. Now, what we're going to do is I'd like to give the shir tomorrow night because it's Jeff Kaplan's Yotzat. So we are going to read the Mishnah again because Mishnah and Neshama have the same letters. And we just need to do it for the schus of Jeff. And just at least you know the explanation. We don't have to re-explain it. We can go straight to the Gemara tomorrow. Guys, I want to thank you for your time. Arthur, are you at the concert? Can you show me what it looks like?
We're almost there. We're just stuck in traffic by the old city. In the old city is a concert.
Wonderful. Have a good time, mate. Guys,
thanks, man.
Damon, what time's the shir tomorrow?
In the evening, because of Jeff's thing. What time is good for you guys? 6:15?
Yes.
15 is fine.
But I have someone at 7 as a student, so if we start at 6:15,
okay, 6. We can start at 6 if you want.
6 or 6:15, whatever. Yeah, that's cool. As long as it's okay with you guys.
Yeah, 6 o'clock, fine. 6.
Fine.